Is Wichita its own worst enemy when it comes to promoting and developing the city? That's what some community leaders are saying. We look into why. 2 new names in the governor's race, another Wichton with lots of legislative and business experience, and maybe an independent whose presence could turn the race for governor upside down. Plus, some 70 Kansas foster kids missing. The state unaware they're gone. Lawmakers want to know why. Some say using private contractors is the source of the problem. That's what we're talking about on Kansas Week, starting right now. The number of missing kids came out when lawmakers were asking questions about a case out of Kansas City when 3 teenage girls disappeared. Welcome to Kansas Week. I'm Pilar Pedraza. This is the latest in a series of concerns about how the Department of Children and Families operates. While the number of missing kids is in line with national averages, the fact department leaders didn't even know has some lawmakers outraged. Kansas made national headlines when lawmakers discovered 70 foster kids are missing, and the department charged with their care didn't know. Nationally, about 1% of foster kids disappear, usually teens who take off to be with family members they miss. And the 70 missing kids in Kansas does work out to about 1% of the number in foster care here. Lawmakers became outraged after they asked the Department of Children and Families about the number, and the agency knew nothing. Representative Steve Alford, a Republican from Ulysses, says that's because of the private contracting system in Kansas, that once the children leave DCF's care for the contractors, DCF stops keeping track of them. He called it a case of, quote, out of sight, out of mind. Now, this is just the latest in a series of complaints the last couple of years about DCF. And we've talked about these cases before here on this show. To help us kind of get some perspective on what's going on, we have Dr. Neil Allen from Wichita State University, Dion Leffler from the Wichita Eagle, who has covered many of these cases along with me, and David Colburn from the Marion County Record. Dion, let's start with you. Is this a surprise given what we've heard the last few years coming out of DCF?
No, I don't really think it's a surprise at all. I think anytime the state anytime the state hands a program over to an independent contractor, you know that you're going to lose control to a certain degree. And I think we've seen that over and over with various state programs as they've been privatized out. And this really didn't surprise me that much, although I will say that I didn't find it quite as disturbing as it might have been, given the number of kids that are missing right now, because we are talking about foster kids. They're coming from broken homes. They've had, they've had problems in the past with their family life, and so they do run away.
Yeah. Well, and certainly the numbers that we were talking about, from what I've read, we are talking mostly teenagers and a very, very small percentage, 1% of the kids that are in the foster care system in Kansas. So it's not like it's an egregious error. And I think even the lawmakers that I've spoken with, the lawmakers that have been quoted in the paper about this, it's not really the fact that the kids are missing that surprises most people. I mean, certainly covering the media, how many times in a newsroom, David, do we get phone calls of people wanting us to search for a runaway child?
Well, it's quite a common thing. And what we run into, I think, in terms of dealing with programs like this, is that not everybody is in the loop. I mean, this is an issue of communication within the department, in terms of communication between divisions, knowing what's going on and knowing what's at the top. It shouldn't have been a surprise to any of them that these were there, and so they should have been prepared to answer questions, and they weren't. Now, in previous places where I've worked in other states, this issue has come up as well, not in terms of privatization, but just the number of missing kids. And it is I think it's an ongoing thing that's going to be with us, but you hate to lose any kid out of the system and not know what happens.
Oh yeah, we always want to find out exactly what happens. There's no doubt about that. I guess the question becomes, how much is the government responsible for knowing and taking care of? And talking about this communication issue, as we look at the political aspect of it, how much of this outrage is that we're hearing from some of these lawmakers is truly authentic? How much of it is simply because this has become public?
Well, this particular story will just be another data point for the argument by Democrats and also by moderate Republicans that the government has been starved for revenue in Brownback's time in office, and we have cut every place you could potentially cut before we went to tax increases. And so you would expect these kind of things to happen. And this is probably the same piece with some of the problems at the El Dorado prison, the computer problems involving state welfare programs, and also any of us who happen to have tried to get a driver's license renewed and stood in line for 3 hours could experience what it's like when we try to run a government on the cheap.
Yeah. Although I've got to say, you mentioned the El Dorado prison and the driver's license. We're talking prison. A lot of people are just like, yeah, whatever. The people in prison deserve what they get. Driver's license, it's an annoyance. But the fact of the matter is, we're there, maybe once every 6 years. When we start talking about kids, suddenly, even if it's 1%, even if it's something that we expect because they're from broken homes already, it's runaways. Once we start talking about kids, does this have more political power now?
Quite possibly it does. And also events usually affect the political system and affect elections more if they reinforce something that voters are already willing to believe. And certainly in the last few election cycles, we can tell the Kansans are willing to believe that their government has become too small, too not efficient, and needs more money and also new management. Now, what kind of management that is will depend on where voters are next fall.
Well, and turning back to my journalists, Diana and David, I know working in a newsroom, we get calls and emails all the time about complaints about DCF. Do those start to gain more credence now as a journalist looking into stories than perhaps they had 3 years ago, 4 years ago?
Well, I think it's very difficult. It's a very difficult agency to cover.
Yes.
On a number of fronts. In fact, the last time I went to the office here, they literally tried to have me arrested for speaking to people about the computer problems that they were having.
Well, and to be clear, because we've talked about, you and I have talked individually about this before, you were actually on public property when you were doing that, not on DCF.
Well, I was
premises.
not in. I was in the parking lot at DCF, and so they called the police on me, and that's not speaking to me of transparency, and it's not speaking to me of really anything but image protection.
Yeah.
And that's the problem here is, if you're going to privatize something, if you're going to farm something out to a private company, there must be oversight. The state is responsible. Now, you can farm things out if you want, but you got to keep track of them. And that seems to be one of the big problems the Kansas government is having across the board.
Our biggest problem on the news side has been trying to do positive coverage of this issue in working with DCF, because anytime that we get a press release, and they come out frequently from them saying we need more foster parents, we need more foster homes, we'll get a hold of them and say, give us some Marion County angle to it and help us to find, well, we can't do that. And I said, we can do a story if you can do the legwork to get us the appropriate contacts. But I said, no one is interested in hearing an official say we need more foster care. We've tried to do positive stories, and we've been shut out because we can't get anybody to work with us. So when this comes out, it does make me more inclined to look and say, hey, what's happening? And do I need to be looking into it in my own home county?
Yeah. Well, certainly the concept of openness of government, anytime there's a lack of transparency, a lot of suspicions arise there.
Yes, although DCF is a particularly difficult agency here because we have lots of privacy and disclosure issues involving there, because if you're a newspaper reporter, for example, and you want to go to agencies and say, well, show me a positive situation. Well, then DCF is a little bit different because a kid probably is going to be a minor by definition, and also you're going to have issues involving their previous family. They might not necessarily want publicity. Now that doesn't mean that the DCF can't take your call or can't maybe connect you to somebody who is a recently aged out foster kid. But also, whenever you cut as much as we've cut here, probably some of the first place you cut is public information officers. And and in a place like DCF, they're going to cut public information and people to manage the parking lot, and then they cut down to just the people that deal with placing kids. But also with foster systems, a lot of the big issue is getting enough parents to take kids. And whenever people start taking lots of foster kids, then they have the experience of getting calls over and over because desperate social workers call them at midnight to keep this kid from having to go to a group home, or as we found recently, to
Sleeping
be
on the office
sleeping
floor.
in the floor of the office of a
Yeah.
contractor.
Yeah. Certainly not an issue that has an easy solution. As we discussed last week, to fund the fixes here, you got to cut someplace else or you got to raise taxes, neither of which popular right now. Now, whoever is elected as the next governor in November of 2018 will have a large hand in what happens next with DCF. And this last week, there was one official new candidate for the job. Joining a crowded field is Wichita businessman Ed O'Malley. This last week, Ed O'Malley became the 10th Kansan to officially announce he wants the Republican nomination for the governor's race. O'Malley spent 3 years in the state legislature representing Roland Park in Johnson County. 10 years ago, he came to Wichita to start the nonprofit Kansas Leadership Center. He's taking a leave of absence from his position of CEO at the center. He'll face off against 9 other Republicans in the fight for the nomination, including 3 high schoolers. The August primaries will decide. We've talked so often about this crowded field, and it just seems like every time I turn around, it's getting more crowded and more crowded. Let's start with you, Dr. Allen. This is your bailiwick, but what does this tell us about the state of politics in Kansas right now?
Well, it's competitive. And so it's competitive not just between the parties, but internally among different factions of the parties. So the O'Malley announcement is interesting because he's a clearly moderate candidate. He was a moderate in the legislature. He's trying to define himself as a problem solver and as kind of a nonpartisan, but he's clearly anchored on the left side of the Republican spectrum. And it makes sense to try as a candidate like that because moderates have done pretty well recently in primaries. And also, Chris Kobach is driving everything because he's a strong candidate and he can get to the final 2 candidates almost certainly, but he has certain kind of a high floor and a high ceiling, and so any candidate could conceivably have a scenario where if they get one-on-one with Kobach, they could beat him. So that's going to bring lots of Republicans in. It's also going to bring more Democrats in. Although, ironically though, the fact that Kobach looks beatable means that more Republicans run, and the more Republicans run, the stronger Kobach is.
Catch-22. So, Diane, David, you and I have all covered so many elections over the years. And one thing that we see right now, very crowded field. Your gut feeling, how many of these candidates have the staying power?
By staying power, do you mean that
To last
they'll
till
finish
August?
the race?
Yeah.
I think there's probably at least 3 or 4 that are solid candidates that will draw a significant number of votes, and it probably would be wrong of me to say who I thought they were. But I think one of the things that tends to happen is, when you have an open seat, they don't come along very often at the governor level.
Yeah. There's usually an heir apparent.
So there's usually the next guy, the next person in line. And so I think that's driving, some of this is that everybody, it's like you got a chip in a chair, you got a chance, like they say in poker. And so one thing that I think on the Republican side you see is that, you've got, 8 or 9 candidates competing for the conservative vote. And Ed O'Malley seems to be more of the moderate guy.
No.
So he could score. No. It's just hard to say exactly what's going to happen with this many candidates all competing for the same vote. You've got Chris Kobach, obviously he's a strong candidate. You got Jeff Collier. Jeff Collier will have a year as governor by the time the election rolls around because Governor Brownback will be leaving.
No.
So if he can solve school finance or do something, that differentiates him from what's happened in the past, I think I think he could challenge Kobach for that.
I would almost say that if Jeff Collier can solve the school finance conundrum in Kansas, he deserves the nomination.
It is a long.
It's quite a long shot.
It is a long-standing fight, but
Yeah.
he's going to inherit that when he comes in, of the Supreme Court decision that
Yeah.
says come up with a better way to fund schools, and how he handles that is really his audition for the job.
Yeah.
I would guess that probably by the time next August rolls around, we'll see at least half of this group, on the sidelines and will not be in it. And I really believe that still that's a crowded field.
Oh,
and I really believe that some of these candidates are going to do well if they actively court the rural vote. Right now, for example, we have tried to contact two of these candidates that have some kind of a connection with the county. And not only, we haven't even gotten a response from one of them. And the other was, oh, thank you for touching base.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll see you. And yet, on ag issues in Marion County, we've had some of the national leaders of organizations, their ag advocacy. And yet, they're passing us by right now when they've got that brain trust. So I think that they need to pay some attention to the rural areas, and I think somebody may pick up some things in those areas that might help them pull a surprise.
Yeah, you pick up the rural areas and add that to Wichita, and you might have enough votes to combat that eastern Kansas population density. So we'll have to wait and see. Probably the biggest news this last week about the governor's race, though, not an official announcement. Rather, news that independent Greg Orman has taken the first steps to assembling a campaign staff. It's a move that some say could turn the race upside down.
Olathe businessman Greg Orman gained statewide recognition 3 years ago when he managed to get closer to unseating Senator Pat Roberts than anyone else ever has. This last week, a manager of Orman's 2014 campaign confirmed to the Wichita Eagle, quote, Orman has done preliminary polling in the governor's race and has interviewed potential campaign staff. But those close to Orman say he hasn't made any final decisions. He's known for his stance against special interests in politics, and so far, the Eagle sources say, Orman has self-funded his campaign.
And that Eagle article that we're talking about, of course, Diane, is yours. So I'm going to start with you. What was the most surprising thing that you found as you were working on this piece?
Well, I think the surprise to me was I thought that there was kind of a gentleman's agreement, if you will, that Greg Orman might stay out of this one. In his previous race for Senate, he got a lot of help from the Democratic Party, and
Unofficially.
well, unofficially, but they shared some stuff with him.
Yeah.
And a lot of the voters that he brought in, or a lot of the voters that came to his campaign, were Democrats. They had the, obviously the Democrat dropped out of the race to give him a clear shot at Pat Roberts. So I think that what you're seeing is a lot of anger on the Democratic side that he's sort of noodling around the idea of getting into this race because the conventional wisdom is that he would take votes away from the Democratic candidate to a much larger extent than he would take votes away from a Republican candidate, and that would pretty much hand the seat to the Republican nominee.
And we were talking about the rural vote as we were discussing O'Malley. How are you seeing voters reacting to the idea of an independent in this race in your part of Kansas, away from the big cities?
I know that back when Orman was running before, it was very lukewarm. Folks were pretty well set on the idea of a Republican, and we don't have, we go through elections where we don't have a single Democrat on the ballot. So we're very strongly oriented that way, and still strong party affiliations. So there's some skepticism about anyone who's not affiliated with the party when they're running. But I do have to say that, like so many candidates these days, Orman put together a book and sent one out, to everybody he could send it out to. And I actually bothered to read it, and I thought a lot of what he presented in there was done very thoughtfully, very responsive to issues that our voters are interested in. So it may be a question of how he delivers the message in terms of whether he's going to be successful as to whether or not it's really a problem with the message itself.
Well, I know when I met him during that Senate race against Pat Roberts, he was very personable, and I found the information that he presented to be quite credible and well put together, carefully thought out. But is that enough in Kansas?
Well, third-party candidates almost never win elections. And if they do win an election, it's normally because they replace, in effect, one of the other party's candidates. And so that's what Orman did in 2014 in the Senate race. And the Democrats were more than happy to have him because they had a subpar candidate, and also their party was in a period of weakness. That is not true anymore. The Democratic Party is far stronger than it was 4 years ago. And so now the Democrats have several decent candidates running for office, and those candidates are not going to abdicate to try to more or less soft endorse Orman like they did last time. And so this is an entirely different context than the one that Orman ran in before. And so before, he gave hope to the Democrats of having some person in that office that they could work with. Now I think Diane's exactly right, that if Orman is in the race and spending a lot of his own money, it makes it very difficult for a Democrat to win. But I'm sure Orman thinks, okay, well, Chris Kobach is possibly the most partisan Republican who appeals to independents the least. He's the favorite. On the Democratic side, Jim Ward is probably the most partisan Democrat with a statewide profile, and he looks to be the favorite right now. And so Orman's best shot is to shoot between Ward and Kobach. Now, my guess is that's still 20% third place. Because Democrats like Ward, Republicans mostly like Kobach, except for maybe the Rotary Club set. And so, but Orman really doesn't have anywhere else to go unless he wants to become a Democrat, and that clearly he doesn't want to do that.
And he probably couldn't at this point because, I mean, he did publish a book.
Yeah.
He published a manifesto about independent candidates. So,
well, but I'm sure the Democrats would be willing to have him to run for insurance commissioner or secretary of state or something else. But some of the trouble about this is you have a situation where you have someone wanting to come in at the very top of politics without doing the work beforehand.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see. Now, city and county leaders have worked hard the last few years to help Wichita grow and improve. But some are saying the way Wichitans think and talk about their city is one of the biggest stumbling blocks they face. Is Wichita its own worst enemy? Emily Younger with our news partners at KSN TV takes a look.
On the outside,
I am learning that the city is continually underrated.
It appears Wichita is thriving. Old Town is a popular hotspot. The arts and food truck scene have taken off, and the city's flag movement is flourishing. But the economy?
Unfortunately, the numbers aren't so rosy here.
Just this week, personal finance website Wallet Hub named Wichita the fourth slowest growing large city in America, ranking it 396th in population growth and 452nd in job growth compared to 515 U.S. cities.
We need to wake up.
That wake up starts with the people who live here in their attitudes, according to Sedgwick County Commissioner Jim Howell.
One of the people on our own trip said, come to Wichita and you'll like us better than we do. Well, that was kind of a funny joke, but the reality is there's some truth to that.
Howell says there's a stigma surrounding the city, and too many people aren't proud to call the air capital of the world home.
If you have someone that's negative and they're critical and they're looking at all the negative, horrible things in our community and they don't understand what's good about our community, that has an impact on others.
Last month, Howell and other community leaders visited Raleigh, North Carolina to learn how the city has transformed itself into one of the nation's most sought-after communities. His biggest takeaway?
They have some of the same challenges we have, but their attitude is, they're aware of those problems, but they don't focus on those problems as being why they're negative about their own community. Because attitude is contagious, and really, we've got so much to celebrate here. We just need to know it.
Now, I've got to say, honestly, as somebody who moved to Wichita as an adult, I really haven't heard a lot of this, but I've heard complaints about complainers in the city. As folks who've been around a little longer, especially you, Diane, what has your experience been?
Well, my experience was that people in Kansas tend to be very friendly to other people in Kansas. I'm not sure they have the same attitude toward people from outside of Kansas. And you see it with our turnpike. Millions of people drive through this state on the turnpike, and they don't stop because we don't invite them. I understand what Commissioner Howell is saying, but I think we have to be realistic too about what we have to offer. We have some things that are kind of cool, but not things that people would travel long distances to see. No. I think if we want to, be more friendly, be more open, be more, civic pride, maybe we need to look at, bring in people who are already coming through here into the city.
David, coming from an area slightly farther out, I know as I visited places like Lindsborg and Newton, as I move up the 135 corridor there's a lot of very positive activity there, and those areas seem to be growing. Is that a model that Wichita needs to be looking at?
Well, I don't know, because the communities are quite a bit different, and there are things that attract people to those smaller communities that wouldn't bring them to Wichita. I think the more troubling issue here is on the hard economic side. I mean, we can talk about travelers coming through and inviting them in, but I think what we see in this piece is that it's something that affects a lot of places, and it affects us in Marion County too, is that we're looking at the tourism side, we're looking at the entertainment side of things, and we're looking at some quality of life issues without looking nearly as hard at what are these people going to do for work. Okay, what are we providing for them in terms of businesses coming in with different kinds of things. I've heard just this morning about a potential distributor who was considering Marion County and then ended up putting his business in Salina, and because we couldn't come up with what they needed. And I think that's as much as anything here, to get the people, you're going to have the jobs.
So to put this in political terms, is it all about the economy? Is that what we're really dealing with?
Well, and also Wichita is an aircraft manufacturing city at its core, and it is cyclical based upon that industry, and outsourcing has hurt, and we've been trying to diversify in lots of ways. But also, just saying good things about the city, while it might be necessarily true, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a whole bunch of Saudi oil princes to come buy our airplanes.
Well, it's something that will have to be considered, I guess, but maybe not well recommended from this table. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us this week. It's been a very enjoyable conversation. Hope to see you again here soon. And I'd like to thank you as well. We hope to hear from you on these topics and others. Just email us at kansasweek@kpts.org or look us up on Twitter and Facebook. For now, have a great week.